All right, when we left off on Wednesday, we were talking about the causes of imperialism, European imperialism, things like the motivating factors of nationalism, including race sciences, social Darwinism, and the white man's burden. Right. We also talked about industrialization and how there was a need for those raw materials, a need for cheap or free labor, a need for captive markets as well, right? So these are all the things that motivated the Europeans to seek out more colonies, right? To collect colonies, as it were. And so today we're going to focus on colonization on the African continent, in particular. So let's go see how they did that. Okay. So as of 1880, only a few European nations actually had colonies in Africa. There was French Algeria and a couple of British colonies down in southern Africa. Um, but obviously, that was a resource that they were really eager to tap into, since they no longer had really access to the Americas because of all of those, remember, Enlightenment, nationalist revolutions. So, in the early 1880s, Portugal calls for an international meeting, basically wants to get everyone together to talk about how they are going to tackle um, dividing up Africa. And, it was something that had already been happening sort of illegitimately, under the table. People have been talking about um, deals, striking deals about who was going to get access to what parts of the continent. And so Portugal basically just called everyone out and said, okay, we need to make sure that we're doing this above board, in the light, legitimately. So that led to the Berlin Conference of 1884. Um, a lot of times you will see the phrases the partitioning of Africa, you'll see the scramble for Africa. All of those are centered around this particular event, the Berlin Conference, right? So the Berlin Conference was this international meeting between Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Great Britain. Remember, Germany was a relatively new nation state. They had only been unified in 1871. Italy became a nation state in 1848. So, you know, a couple of those smaller nations really had something to prove by getting as much territory and resources as possible from this Berlin conference. And hopefully you'll notice one very important group of people that are missing from this Berlin conference dealing with the partitioning of Africa. That is literally any Africans, right? So that kind of gives you a sign again of that nationalist, imperialist point of view, right? That they didn't really need to ask the Africans because it wasn't about them, because it's about doing this for their own good and also for the good of the European nations. So basically, 2 years of discussion at the Berlin conference leads them to the agreement that they're all just gonna, first come, first serve, right? Recognize the claims of whoever gets there first. So that's when really we see the phrase "the scramble for Africa" used, right? Because it really does become a scramble of these European nations trying to get to the interior of Africa to establish claims on territory and get access to the best resources, even though they don't really know what's there. They really don't have a good idea of what there is in the sub-Saharan interior, for reasons that we'll see in just a moment. It's kind of like the Americas. It's like a mystery prize, right? Yeah, this land of unlimited economic potential, right? So what some of those European nations end up doing, especially Britain, is they send in individual explorers like David Livingstone or Henry Morton Stanley, essentially to scope things out, to scout the interior, and of course these guys would send reports. They would send letters back to their home country, and oftentimes they had those letters and those reports published in newspapers. So this whole process of imperialism and exploration became really romanticized in European society. So what it turns out they're mostly looking for in the African continent, again, this is mostly sub-Saharan Central Africa, were mineral resources like diamonds and gold. Salt to an extent, right? Because that's also a mineral resource that we know, especially West Africa, had a lot of access to. But also things like rubber and ivory. So remember, rubber comes from a tree. And ivory, we know, comes from animal tusks, specifically elephants. So some of these are luxury items, but especially things like rubber and other types of lumber are really important for the manufacturing process. So that is, part of the focus there, is finding those raw materials to be manufactured in these industrial European nations, right? So when it comes to the gathering of raw materials and resources, we have one sort of infamous example of the Congo Free State, run by Leopold II, who's the king of Belgium. So he controlled the Belgian Congo as an independent venture. Essentially, the Belgian Congo was not, the Congo Free State really was not owned by Belgium. It was owned by Leopold II independently and privately, right? And he brought in independent contractors or independent companies to essentially, use these resources like rubber. They paid him for that material, and so he was able to, have those earnings privately, separate from his finances, with the crown or with the nation state of Belgium, right? And so the way that they controlled the population was that they essentially came in and enslaved the whole native population in the Congo Free State, and used, very intense and unethical means to control that population, right? So there's the pictures in the book of mutilation and amputation, and then of course their intense use of the raw materials like rubber led to extreme environmental degradation in those areas. And that's not something that was really constrained to the Congo Free State by any means, right? There's also another really infamous example in Cecil Rhodes. Oh, sorry. By the way, Leopold II, eventually, when they found out what he was doing in the Congo Free State, when the state of Belgium found out what he was doing there, they actually took it from him. They said, you don't get to have this anymore, and tried to go in and sort of tone a lot of that down. I'm not going to say that they fixed everything, because I don't know that they did, off the top of my head. It's not very likely that they did, but definitely toned a lot of that down. So Cecil Rhodes was a mining magnate, meaning that he made a ton of money working in mining, specifically diamond mining, in the Cape Colony, so Southern Africa, right? Cape Colony is now Cape Town. But so he was made the prime minister of Cape Colony. And he essentially acted in the name of the British Crown, because he was not only the prime minister of the Cape Colony, but he was also the head of the British South Africa Company, right? So instead of the British East India Company, it's the British South Africa Company. So you can see how maybe there might be a little bit of conflict of interest there, being the head of the British South Africa Company, that economic venture, that joint stock company, and also being the prime minister, right? The head government official in the Cape Colony, right? But in both roles, really, he was acting in the name of the British Crown, but of course, feeding the interests of his own companies, which did not just include the British South African Company. Like I said, he made a lot of money in mining, diamonds and jewels, and so he was trying to feed those interests as well, right? So Cecil Rhodes was not only infamous for, of course, like unethical mining practices, but also this idea of Cape to Cairo, right? Where he wanted a solid line of British colonies, all the way from Cape Town to Cairo in Egypt, right? And this was largely so that they could build, a railroad line to string up a telegram, which was a new thing at the end of the 1800s. Basically, just have solid control all the way across the African continent. Because obviously for infrastructure reasons, for logistical reasons, like that would just make things so much easier if they could put raw materials and things on a train in South Africa and send it all the way up to Cairo, to the Mediterranean, rather than having to set out from the Cape of Good Hope and go around West Africa, right? It's just less dangerous in a way. So Cape to Cairo is a phrase that's used to kind of talk about that whole idea of British control, British imperialism in Africa, as a means for having again access to these raw materials to feed their manufacturing back in Europe, right? It is, to an extent, if I had to draw a comparison to something you might already be familiar with, it's similar to the idea of manifest destiny in the US. And it's about the same time period too, right? But Cape to Cairo is that kind of British version, British imperialism in Africa, right? So this is something I wanted to share with you guys that is related to Cecil Rhodes and the British South Africa Company. So this on the right here is an image that was published in Punch magazine. Punch magazine was a satirical magazine. Basically, they made fun of stuff similar to The Onion today, and so this was a comic that they or cartoon, a political cartoon that they published along with a poem, essentially, kind of poking fun at Cecil Rhodes, right? And so there's a stanza, a part of it right there on the left, right? The British South African Company shares may be at a discount. Trade martyrs, trade martyrs. But he, our Colossus, strides on, he declares, whether with or without chums or charters, or charters. Hooray, we brave Britons are right now to the front, provided we've someone to boss us, and the scuttlers will have their work cut out to shunt this stalwart, far-striding Colossus. So the joke here is that you've got Cecil Rhodes, who is, got 1 foot on Cape Town, 1 foot on Cairo, kind of embodying that Cape to Cairo idea. He's holding up a telegraph line as well. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that it's supposed to be a reference to the classical world, basically the Colossus of Rhodes, meaning a huge statue that was supposedly built in ancient Greece, in the ancient Greek city-state of Rhodes, where it was said to have 1 foot on each side of the entrance to a massive port harbor in Rhodes. And so instead of the Colossus of Rhodes, it's the Rhodes Colossus because it's Cecil Rhodes. You get it, right? So it's kind of poking fun at him, saying that the British South Africa Company is not doing well economically, right? But they're doing it for the sake of fulfilling this idea of Cape to Cairo, right? So he's calling him a trade martyr. Right? And remember, we know that word martyr meaning someone who dies for a religious belief, and so kind of making fun of him or poking at him for being for giving up economic success with this ideal of the Cape to Cairo in mind, right? Like it's a sort of religious ideal. And it even mentions in there, he's doing this, he's striding on, even if he doesn't have chums, like friends, pals, whatever, or charters. So charters meaning like the charters that he's given to, it gives him permission to do things according to the British Crown, like joint stock company charters, right? And so, yeah, so there's, he's making himself the boss of this, calling him stalwart, far striding, like he's somehow sort of brave or noble for doing this. It's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting little comic there. Okay, so we have this idea of, what the Europeans are doing. They have a plan to get in there and divide up Africa into various colonies so they can take advantage of these resources. But remember, I said that part of the problem was that they didn't really understand what they were looking at in the interior of Africa. They had their ideas, Algeria is in northern Africa, French Algeria is northern Africa. Then we've got Cape Town in southern Africa. We know that the Portuguese had all kinds of interactions with the people on the western coast of Africa. So we know that there has been some interaction with African kingdoms and cultures in the past. Why is it that they have such a vague idea of what they're really looking for in Africa? Why did they not go to Africa sooner? And then the question is, what changes in the 1800s to make it possible for them to go in and start dividing up Africa into these various European colonies? So that's what we're looking at next here. So one of the things that changes is they get machine guns, right? It's not just machine guns exclusively, but really just an improvement in this kind of warfare technology, right? Remember, one of the reasons why the Europeans felt justified in doing this was because partially, well, they could, right? That they had the military technology. And so improvements in guns and other firearms definitely help drive this ability and justification. So machine guns in particular help because of a few improvements that are made in firearm technology in the West. So not just Europe, but the US as well. Basically, first of all, they stopped making guns that are muzzle load. So like muskets, where you used to have to pour in the gunpowder, you would put in a piece of cotton, put in the bullet, the sort of little musket ball, and then you'd have to get a long rod and tamp it down into the gun, into the musket, and then you could fire. And that whole process took time, right? And that's, during the American Revolution, that's how the Minutemen get their name. The Minutemen is because it said they could load a musket in under a minute, which a minute's a long time, right? A minute's really a long time. So they developed the technology to not have to load guns from the front, one bullet at a time, but rather to have breech load guns, meaning that you load them from the side. And often in a lot of these cases, especially with the machine guns, you could actually have a string or a ribbon of bullets kind of all tied together that you could feed into the gun for it to fire them rapidly, rather than having to feed them into one end one at a time, right? So that breech load makes it much, much faster. There's also, like revolvers, where you could put 6 or so bullets in the chamber at once, and it would just rotate through them. Similar kind of idea with shotguns, that you could open up, put a couple of cartridges in, and then go, right? So just much faster to reload the guns, just making them more efficient, right? So Gatling guns are the first kind of iteration of this, and right at the top there, that top picture, that is a Gatling gun. You can tell it's got bigger wheels, and it looks like a bunch of guns just strapped together, because really that's partially what it is that you would just turn a crank and it would kind of cycle through each of those barrels, and you would feed ammunition into it to fire rapidly, right? And then they kind of evolved that into the Maxim gun, which you can see at the bottom there. That's more towards the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. And while it's a similar concept, they're just more efficient. And you can see even like the ribbon of ammunition being fed in there as well. So the Gatling guns become especially popular in the US during, Manifest Destiny, which again, remember, is kind of the US version of Cape to Cairo. Maxim guns become more popular, like I said, in the early 20th century or early 1900s, especially in Africa. So yeah, with these machine guns, obviously they are rapid fire, very much lethal, and they have the benefit of interchangeable parts, right? So interchangeable parts coming from the idea of the assembly line sort of process, and industrialization. Essentially, if a part of the gun broke, you didn't have to get a whole new gun. You could just get that one individual part and replace it. And that made this much more, not just efficient, but like economical, right? That you didn't have to replace the whole gun, just get a new part for it. So having those interchangeable parts made these much easier for the military to get a hold of and maintain. So yeah, they're used all over Africa, India, and the United States as well, especially in the West. with that, remember what we're supposed to call U.S. expansionism, because they don't like the word imperialism. But yeah, so major military changes and modernization, especially. Um, a lot of times with these machine guns, they would take these into places in Africa. Like obviously they've got wheels and stuff, but that doesn't necessarily make them efficient to use in like a jungle or forested setting. So a lot of times they would just roll them up to the closest place they could find and just fire into the trees to scare people, right? They became more of a threat than anything else. It's kind of one of those weapons you only had to use a few times before people kind of learned what they could do and learned to be scared of them, right? So, um, lots of examples of these being used in warfare, especially the British versus various parties within Africa. So the Anglo-Zulu Wars, um, which we don't really have time to talk about these wars in details, but they're pretty interesting. The Anglo-Zulu Wars, which were in part led by the Zulu leader Shaka Zulu, who is one of the few people to actually ever defeat the British, one of the few African indigenous groups to ever defeat the British. And then the Boer Wars, which were fought between the South African Boers and the British, basically the British colonizers. Yeah. The other thing that makes it possible, right? One of the other things so the official word we use is facilitates, right? To make it easier, to make something possible, to make it happen. One of the other things that facilitates European imperialism in Africa is the development of quinine. So quinine is an alkaloid medication that is used to treat malaria, lupus, and arthritis. So it does a few different things. We don't use it as much anymore. But quinine was originally, I believe it's distilled from the bark of a tree from South Africa. I think that's how they process it. But basically it's used, I think, partially as a anti-inflammatory, something that can kind of help with these autoimmune issues, autoimmune disorders, when your immune system attacks itself. So Africa in particular was known for a long time as the white man's grave. You remember how when we talked about the African diaspora, we talked about European, involvement in the African slave trade in West Africa, and I mentioned to you guys that when I was young, I had that kind of misconception that the Africans themselves, the Europeans themselves went into Africa and captured Africans, and that's not really how it happened. This is partially why, because there were diseases like malaria that the Europeans were not immune to or not used to, that killed them quickly and easily and suredly. So they just stopped going into the interior of Africa. There are actually some scientists who believe that sickle cell anemia, which is a blood disorder in which your blood cells aren't shaped like little rafts, they're actually shaped like little sickles or crescent moons. It's something that is actually a lot more common in people of African descent than other populations in the world. There's some scientists who believe that actually developed as a way to help the Africans adapt to bloodborne diseases like malaria, right? So, but the point is the Europeans don't have that adaptation at all. So they died a lot, right? So they didn't go into the interior of Africa, but quinine was something that allowed them to essentially deal with the symptoms, made it so that the symptoms didn't kill you as quickly as before. It wasn't going to cure your malaria, and it didn't necessarily prevent it, but it could make it easier to deal with, so you could live longer with it. And so the British, the Europeans, they take that quinine and put it in carbonated water to make something that we now call tonic water, right? Which is something that is used in cocktails like gin and tonics, which is a very British drink. Gin is a very British alcohol. And one of the cool things about quinine is actually if you shine a black light on it, it fluoresces, it glows, right? So you can kind of see there in the image what it'll do. And I'll try to bring an example for you guys. I have a blacklight flashlight just specifically for this demonstration. So I'll show you guys that eventually. But yeah, so this is really helpful for people, going further into the interior. They don't have to worry as much about malaria killing them as quickly as before. It also becomes really helpful in the building of certain construction projects, infrastructure, where malaria was common among workers. So, in the building of the Suez Canal, which was in Egypt, and the Panama Canal, which we talked about on Wednesday in Panama, right, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. So, we did still lose a lot of people to those diseases when in those infrastructure projects, but really the tonic water helped with that a lot. Okay. And the other thing that facilitated European imperialism in Africa is the building of steamboats and railroads. And so, really, what this is, it's not so much that the it is that the railroads did it, but also that through the later half of the 1800s, there's kind of another wave of industrial development. We sometimes call it the second industrial revolution. But there's a sort of a second wave where they improve upon designs from earlier in the industrial revolution, like railroads and steam engines and things like that. So steam engines kind of get an upgrade. And are attached to boats, right? So we already had the whole train system set up, but they attach the steam engines to boats, which allowed the boats to then sail upriver, right? And traveling along the river is much easier than trying to travel through dense jungle, right? So they could sail upriver into the interior, and basically what they would do is they would take all of the parts for a railroad and put them on these steam engine or these steamboats and just sail them upriver to where they needed to be, and then they would build their way back, basically using these IKEA pallets of railroads, right? Like a build your own railroad, which they could do because in the late 1800s, they developed a much lighter form of steel that could be carried by the boats inland, right? Like more easily without weighing it down as much. So we have more powerful steam engines, lighter steel that we can take into the interior by sailing upriver and then building those railroads, right? And the railroads have more powerful steam engines as well. So smaller and quicker, they're more efficient. They can bring troops in to Africa, bring supplies in and out, and also bring in civilians, right? People to help administer, like be administration and government in these new colonies. And to an extent also like civilians to kind of settle in the regions. So, I like to recommend to you guys various media to go with these things. And one of the things that I had to read when I was in English 4, so my senior year, was a book called The Heart of Darkness. It's basically about a guy who is looking for a lost explorer, and he's sent to Africa to find him. And he kind of travels through the interior, following clues to find this guy. He ends up in the Congo Free State, which is about as horrific as you can imagine it is, right? And he really has to, the main character, Conrad, he really has to face this idea of imperialism and how it had been romanticized in Europe, but he's being faced with the horrific realities of things, and he has to really, deal with that. So it's an interesting book. It's really not that long either. I can show it to you in the classroom if you would like at any point. It's really about a finger's width. It's not that long. So yeah. So it's another one of those things that facilitates imperialism, and really not just in Africa, but also in South Asia as well. So India, right? All right. That's about all I have for right now. This is going to kind of bleed into chapter 19, which remember is due next Wednesday. And then we'll kind of talk about those that continued imperialism, but more so in Asia and the Middle East. All right. Cool. Thank you.